Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midlife Reinvention. Today, I have with me Jill McClennen, and she's known as a Death Doula. So, today, we're actually going to talk about death in a very open way, in a way that I think that we should be addressing it more. I do remember that when my own father was going through his transition, I was blindsided. I didn't know what to expect. Um, I didn't know how to deal with my feelings, with the caregiving that we had to do, with all these things going on. I wish I had a Jill at that time, because that would have just been so helpful. So, Jill, tell us a little bit about your journey and what brought you to where you are today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to this. So, I started working in food service when I was 16. So, I've spent a very long time working in kitchens. I was a waitress, I was a bartender. I mean, I did anything and everything that had to do with food service. And in 2010, my husband and we were living with my grandmother at the time. We moved in with her when she was 90. We opened a bakery together. So my husband and I had our bakery. We had had a baby. So we had a young little infant. And my grandmother's health declined fairly quickly. And so when the doctors sent her home and they said, we're going to send your grandmother home and we're going to suggest hospice. And I said, okay. And they said, who takes care of her? And I said, well, I do. I live with her. And then that was it. They just sent us on our way. And I, of course, am thinking, grandma's going to sleep a lot and then she'll just die in her sleep. And that's probably the way it's going to go because that's what it does in movies. So why would I think it's any different? And we spent, thankfully, it was only 3 weeks from that time that they sent her home till when she did actually die. But by that first night, I knew that I had no idea what I was doing, that this was not what I was expecting it to be. She didn't recognize me. She didn't know who I was. She thought I was trying to kill her. She thought I was a nurse. She was saying to me, my granddaughter has a baby the same age as yours. Because, of course, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm awake with her. I'm trying to nurse this baby. It was insane. And thank God for hospice because when the nurse came in, I just was like, I don't understand. I'm so confused. She goes in and out of knowing who I am. It's not my grandmother the way that I remember her. She's up all night. I don't know what's going on. And the nurse was like, okay, let me explain. This is all normal. This is all natural. This is what happens as people are nearing the end of life. And so once I was able to understand better what was going on, I was able to relax into the situation. I wasn't as overwhelmed. And even, there was times when I would be up with her in the middle of the night and she'd say, don't you hear those women singing? And I was like, what women? She's like, the women that are standing behind you. And I'm like looking over my shoulder. I'm like, I don't see or hear anything. But because I knew to expect that, I was fascinated by it. I was like, oh, well, what are they singing to you? Like I was just talking to her like this was totally normal and natural. And by the time that she died, I was so grateful that we had those 3 weeks together, that I was able to be there with her. And it really was a difficult situation. I know so much more now, though, than I did then. And so, even though at that point I said to my husband, I think I might want to go back to school to be a hospice nurse. And he was like, all right, whatever you want to do. But, again, we had a bakery, which that's a lot of work. We had this baby that was very little. After my grandmother died and we were living in her house, we had to pay all the bills, which we hadn't had to pay because that was the agreement, right? We got to keep her in her home. My grandfather built her that house when they got married when she was 20 and she was now 94 when she died. So she'd lived in that house for 74 years. So we got to keep her in that home. We realized that one of us had to get a real job because food service doesn't pay much and we didn't have health insurance. We didn't have all that stuff. And so then life moved on. We ended up having a second baby. We moved, we both got jobs, but I never lost that thought in the back of my mind of like, this is something I really think I want to do. And so when I heard the term death doula, I really, even thinking about it now, like my body gets all tingly. Like as soon as I heard somebody say it, I was like, that's it. That's the thing that I need to do. And I was coming up on my 40th birthday when I had heard it. And food service is, you're standing all the time, you're carrying things, you're lifting things. At that point, I already was like, I don't think I even want to do this until I'm 65. Even if I could, I don't know if I want to do this until I'm 65. I need to think of something else. And so I heard the death doula term, and then I was like, are you crazy? Like, you have no nursing background, no background in anything other than food service. Like, what is wrong with you? But I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And so once I started to look into it and I started to research it, and then I thought, well, it'll probably take me 10 years to really do this. I was working full time. I had a part-time job teaching at a university. I had two kids, like I thought, okay, I'll take classes a little bit over the next 5 or 10 years, build the business, it'll be fine. And then I started my training in January of 2020. And then by March of 2020, I was home with a lot of time on my hands. So I ended up having my business up and running by July of 2020. And that was not my plan. That was not what I thought was going to happen.
You come from a serving background. You serve people.
Mm-hmm.
So that really, I think, is a nice fit for being a deaf doula because you serve. It's
Mm-hmm.
in you. You've been doing that for so many years. What do you think is the most surprising thing about dying that people don't know about?
Oh my gosh. There's honestly a lot of things that I think people are really surprised with when somebody is dying, because it really is such a different reality, right? When you're with somebody that's nearing the end of life, there's different things that are going on within them. And so their body starts to look different. Again, they maybe don't recognize you as much. It's a lot of emotional labor on a caregiver's part or on somebody's part that's experiencing this. And so I really believe that most of us are just so overwhelmed by the realities of everything having to do with the end of life that we just shut down. We also don't talk about it, right? If somebody experiences it with a parent or a grandparent, you're not going to be at a party talking about it. People don't want to hear it. And so then when we all have to face it in real time, it's just so confusing and so overwhelming. And it really doesn't have to be that way if we could get more comfortable with it and if we could really understand it more. But for me, that was, I think, the most surprising part was just the way that her personality changed. And again, and I see it in clients,
Yes.
where they'll be nearing that stage. They're dealing with some illnesses, like, but we could still have conversations. They're very clear on what they want, what they don't want. But then there's like this like tipping point where they start to kind of get into this phase where the sounds are different. I mean, it's a very different experience. But think about, birth, right? Like anybody that's ever had a baby or been in the room with somebody having a baby, that's again this different, it's a whole different experience. My mother-in-law was in the room when I had both of my children, and there's still things that I'm like, you saw a whole lot that we wouldn't normally be doing or saying or experiencing together, right? We had that experience during that time of my life. And that's why death really is, in some ways, very similar. It can be messy, it can be painful, it can be very emotional and exhausting and all these things. But that's just part of the natural process. But we want to numb, we want to medicate, we want to just put everything in these little boxes and kind of like put it away. We don't want to see it. And it's unfortunate because it can be a really beautiful experience. I've talked to people that they'll say, I had the best relationship with my parents when they were dying because all of our filters came down, all of our walls came down. We were able to say things to each other that we were not able to say in the past. Because that's the thing, even if somebody has those periods like my grandmother, where they maybe don't know who you are, they're just very, like, I would almost say, like, in a different place already, there's still those moments when it's them and it's very much them. And you can have a conversation and you could say some of these things, but we need to be comfortable first in being able to sit and witness these things that we just don't see every day.
That's why I wish we would talk about it more because I know, like my father's death was very different from my mother's death. With my father, we did not know what to expect. We had time because he had cancer. And it was very interesting because towards the end, my siblings dropped off. They couldn't handle it. It was just me, my mom, and then my other sister finally came back. But it was interesting to see how people reacted or processed what was happening. With my mom, it was very interesting because we had gone through my father's death. We were all there with my mother. We were actually there the entire week. And there was a lot of celebrating. My mom was clear headed until she went into the coma. So it was very much a very different death. A lot of celebrating. She ate until the last day. Um, it was a beautiful death, very different from my father's. And so it just got me thinking about how we approach death and how we think about it. Nobody talks about it. It's such a mystery. I have counseled so many friends who are now going through this period of losing their parents. We're now at that age where parents are going. And I think everyone should have a Death Doula. I really do. Because we are so supportive with birth doulas, the starting of life, but the ending of life often doesn't get the same support. You're surrounded by nurses that you may not know. Well, if you got to know a death doula, it's a constant that's there that can guide you. So I think it's beautiful work that you're doing. And I think it's also work that needs more attention and more understanding of the value that a death doula brings to the experience. So, your work is a beautiful thing. When you think back, was there a particular death that stands out in your mind, either in some way, that you could share?
Uh, Honestly, the one that probably stands out the most in my mind was a gentleman that I connected with, that I volunteer at a hospital. And so I only saw him once. But, I went into his room and we actually were both bakers. So we talked a lot about baking and, the whole food service thing, which was really lovely. But the biggest thing was, he had already lost his wife. His sister had recently died. He had nobody. He was just alone. And he just was ready. He was ready to die. And, sitting with him, like, it's not like he was depressed. He wasn't suicidal, but he was like, I really have nothing else here. Like, I'm not well. I have nobody. All of my people have already left. I'm just ready to move on. And I find it really frustrating sometimes that so many people in society just can't understand how we can prolong life a really, really long time. But yet, when somebody says, you know what, I'm tired, it's time, they get so much pushback. There's so much like, but you need to keep doing these treatments. You need to keep doing this thing. Like, why can't we just let people transition more easily? And he actually sent me through my volunteer coordinator at the hospital. He sent me a birthday card because I had seen him like a week before my birthday. And he sent me a birthday card. And inside it, he wrote a poem and he said, "Roses are red. Thank you for helping me drop dead." And then he signed it love and then his name. And I have the card in this room. I was so, I mean, it just was such a touching moment to just sat with him and to hear him saying that he was ready to go. And I wasn't trying to talk him out of it. I wasn't trying to say, oh no, hang on, you've got, there was none of that. I was just like, I I hear you. I can understand that. And I think we need to do more of that. I think we do need to do more listening to people and not trying to fix, not trying to change, not so focused on prolonging life at all costs. Because we can keep people alive a really long time, but that doesn't mean that they're living. Their body might be alive, but they're not living anymore. And I'd love to see, like you said, we need to talk about these things more. We need to have more conversations about the reality of it, because that is sometimes why it is so difficult for people when they're navigating the end of life with a loved one, is because we've really prolonged their life too long. And so by the time that we get to that point where we can't do anything else. Like it really just has to be the end. It can just be traumatic and exhausting and overwhelming, but it really doesn't have to be that way. And if we were more comfortable talking about it, we'd be more comfortable advocating for ourselves and for our loved ones. Because that's something that my mom has said to me is she feels really guilty that my grandmother at 90 got diagnosed with cancer, and then she went through these treatments for 4 years that possibly didn't even extend her life. They just caused her a lot of pain and suffering. So the last couple of years of her life, she was in a lot of pain and suffering. And I said, well, first off, we didn't know better. We didn't know to ask questions that I now know I would ask them. She wanted to try these things because, again, her doctor was saying that she should, rather than saying, well, if you don't do it, you might die in 3 years. If you do it, you might live for 4, but those last 3 years, you might be in a lot of pain. So, like, we need to give people these tools to ask the right questions, to advocate for themselves and for their loved ones, and to really understand that extending life at all cost is not always the best option for what people really want. And that's where we need to have these conversations too with our loved ones. What is important to us, as we age, as we're going through different illnesses? What's the most important thing to me is not going to be the same for you, but we need to have these conversations with our loved ones so that when the doctors are asking questions, we're not going, I don't know, we never talked about it. I was too afraid to talk about it. We wanted, because we could
Well,
avoid it now. That doesn't mean that we avoid it forever. We're gonna have to face it eventually. So it's better to do it now than wait until we're in crisis to have these conversations.
that is so true. And those are hard, hard conversations to have. Hard conversations to have. And we need to do them. But I think that we, as a society, we don't face them. So I think you're making some really good points here about quality of life and end of life. What, sorry, what product to the leftover of it. So I think, what do you think people need to do to become more aware of how to handle that better?
Well, listening to a podcast episode about death is a good place to start, right? Hearing people talk about it, hearing it not be a morbid conversation, right? Whenever I have these conversations, I try to make it so it's not morbid or depressing or super heavy. I mean, again, it's going to be a little bit triggering for people that have never talked about it, but having the conversations yourself doesn't mean that you have to sit down and make it super serious. Like, I want to have this conversation with you. We need to talk about these things. It can just be a question. I mean, that's where I even have a Facebook group where every day I post a different question that has to do with either death or dying or grief or even living life, right? Because all those things are very tied together. And I've had a lot of people say to me, the question that you posted today in your group really got me thinking. And then I would like talk to my husband about it, and I talk to my dad about it, and I talk to my children about it. So it doesn't have to be this like, we need to sit down and have this conversation. It's like, hey, have you ever thought about what you would want? If maybe say maybe you got diagnosed with an illness. Have you thought about what you would want? Would you want to do all the treatments? Would it depend? Maybe, start little conversations like that. And that's really one of the things that, at least I do as a death doula, and not all death doulas do this. But I do an end of life care plan with my clients. And that could be with anybody. You can be any age at any stage of life, because again, we need to think about these things. And so I have a whole bunch of questions that I talk to my clients about to really help them get clear on what's important to them so that if they get diagnosed with an illness, they're not having to be like, well, I don't know. What do I want? I never even thought about it. It's like, okay, let me go back to this plan that I created. And then I will even have conversations with the family. I've, basically mediated conversations between parents and children of like, this is what we talked about, this is what they want. Because again, they're not always comfortable having that conversation on their own. And so having somebody else that's kind of, I'm not emotionally invested in the situation. So it's a little bit easier for me to say, well, okay, but at this point, they've been going through treatments. They're really not feeling well. They don't think it's doing anything. They want to maybe consider coming off treatment and moving more to like a comfort care of like, let's just stay comfortable for as long as possible. But it's easier for me to maybe say that to somebody's children than for them to say it.
It's
And
so
so,
true.
right. And it is. And that's where like, I will probably need to hire a death doula when I need to have this conversation with my mother, right? As my mother ages. Cause like you said, I don't remember if we were recording yet or not, but just how like, I'm 45. I'm starting to get to the point where my friends were starting to deal with illnesses with our parents, early onset dementia, like just things that we're out of the getting married and having babies. We're now moving into the like, our parents are aging and they're starting to need more care phase of life. So when it's time for me to have this conversation with my mom, I'll probably need somebody else, right? Outside of just me. So it's normal, it's natural for these conversations to be uncomfortable and to be difficult, but there is tools, there are people, right? We can help you get through these conversations. And even now, there's a lot of books, there's podcasts. I mean, I have my own podcast and I started it because I wanted people to get comfortable hearing these conversations. And sometimes I'll interview professionals. Sometimes I just interview people that just want to talk to me and tell their story about what it was like when their parents or their sister or whoever else um, basically went through the process, right? So I like to just have it be something that little doses over time, right? It's not like I'm ever going to say to somebody, all right, so sit down tonight and have the conversation. A good place to start sometimes too is just saying out loud, I'm going to die. My loved ones are going to die. It's part of life. But so many of us have never said that. And the first time you say it, it's possibly going to feel a little uncomfortable. Like it makes me sad to think about my husband dying. It makes me really sad to think that potentially my children could die. There's really no guarantee. People's children die every day. That still makes me feel a little bit like I'm going to cry just thinking about it. But not thinking about it isn't going to save me from that. What it has really done is that now every time I drop my children off at school, every time my husband leaves for a business trip, I'm so much more conscious and aware of saying goodbye. I love you. I'll see you when you get home. My son was mad at me the other day because he got in trouble for something, and he's 13. So, of course, it was like, my fault. And he wouldn't talk to me. And he was like, really? But you know what? I just was very gentle. I was very kind because I really, even today when I dropped him off at school, he's still a little upset with me. But God forbid if something were to happen to him, I don't want him to think I was mad at mom. And so she didn't say goodbye. She didn't say I love you because I was being mean to her. So no matter what, I'm always like, just remember how much I love you because it's the truth. If I were to have something happen or if he was to have something happen, I know that I would feel okay that he knew how much I loved him, even if he was mad at me and even if I was annoyed with him and I had to basically punish him for the weekend, like that's the biggest gift that I have found since I became a death doula is it's made me more present, more grateful, more appreciative for every moment that I have with my loved ones. And not in a depressing way. It honestly is in a way that I know what a gift it is every moment that I have with them.
I think your work has brought a whole new awareness in your life. It's just listening to you, how you have shifted, because you're more aware of how you live because you're around death
Mhm.
in such an intimate way. It just kind of awakens you to how you want to live better or more deeply. So, and that's a beautiful thing through your work. Yeah. So, if any of you are listening and you have a loved one who is going through a process of letting go and transitioning, contact Jill with the links below and reach out, listen to her podcast. We have to become more comfortable with that to be able to really enjoy life fully, because like birth, death is part of life. And eventually, our own lives will come to that point.
Mhm.
Mhm. So, Joe, thank you for your work and thank you for sharing your journey with us. Any last things or pieces of advice you would like to wrap up with?
Yeah, just if anybody does have any questions, if you need any support, I do online trainings just around different things, caregiving and planning for end of life. But I also I'm happy to talk to people and just help guide them on how to start getting okay with death and dying. So just reach out, don't hesitate. I'm on all the social medias. You can find me on my website. You could email me, whatever you need.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your journey.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.